Right, so coming up now for you, we have A.P. Bangert's short story, Life's Gardener.
Oh.
When I first saw this garden, it was nothing more than a festering bog of sodden, rotting grass and mud. There really was more than enough builder's rubble and glass discarded about the place to fill a skip, with bits of rain-dampened paper that blew here and there until snagging on the vicious-looking thorns of the only plants that dared to grow. All in all, I at once decided this little plot of land was naught but a dump. But of course, this was only my opinion. For you see, there was another. This second opinion came in the form of a middle-aged man, a rather gentle and genial old soul, who, whilst stroking his snowy white beard, gazed at this otherwise bomb site with the ageless wonder of a child. What could he possibly see that I couldn't, I wondered. I would have asked, but he seemed so content in his personal contemplations that I didn't want to intrude upon nor disturb his thoughts. And besides, I was already late for football practice as it was. An hour or so later, as I returned from practice, and upon rounding the corner of the street, I could clearly make out the telltale traces of steely blue wisps of smoke gently rising up from his little plot. Thereafter, and upon drawing level, I could see him feeding the ragged remnants of paper that had previously been the prisoner of the vicious-looking thorns, feeding them with a toss of the hand gesture to a hungry little fire that both crackled and snapped with undisguised relish at receiving such generous offerings. Why bother? I mused. Would it really make any difference at all? I certainly didn't think so. Anyway, the words hungry, feeding and relish held a much greater interest for me at that very moment. Feelings no doubt brought about due to the rather alluring smell of fried onions wafting from within my house. Day after day the same thing occurred. This moved here, that moved there, and whatever the little fire could easily digest was duly fed to it. I recall with great clarity the momentous Battle of the Thorns, as this was the day that blood was quite literally spilt. He grabbed at them, they grabbed at him. He pulled hard, they tore his gloves. He pulled harder, and they tore his flesh. But in the end, the little fire gleefully ate both the torn gloves and the uprooted vicious thorns alike. Time for self-defence classes. But I noticed as I passed his garden, whilst on my way, that the builder's rubble was now in one big pile, standing upright as it was, like some modern-day pyramid, and a shimmering diamond-like mound of broken glass that had sprung up next to it was now growing steadily higher. The once rotten grass was already beginning to give way to rich, dark brown soil that had been turned and turned again, and I had to admit that perhaps it didn't so much resemble a bomb site any longer. On my return I noticed that an altogether new pile had appeared next to the many other ones. It was a delivery of builder's sand and other assorted materials. For some unknown reason I found it personally amusing that he seemed to be collecting piles instead of getting rid of them. But then, what did I know? Each to his own, as they say. A couple of days later, and whilst waiting for friends to call, I witnessed the start of a gardener's cookery lesson, the main ingredient being the pile of rubble that was in essence the derelict remains of an old farm wall. To this was added the pile of builder's sand, a dash of cement, a liberal sprinkling of water, and a fair old portion of elbow grease. I would have watched him longer, and who knows, perhaps I may have even offered to help, but my mates were calling, and I had a bus to catch to town. In my absence the lesson had continued, with the ingredients being meticulously added together, the mixture prepared, and the fair portion of elbow grease well and truly applied. My return saw the final outcome of his day's baking, which came in the shape of an ornate stone wall that was being left to set in the last dying rays of the day's sun. Saturday morning, and the time of ritual pilgrimage had arrived, a time when an enormous throng of people would descend upon one place wearing the latest colours and scarves, and sing the latest songs or bellow with gleeful gusto the latest chants. I would be one of that hopeful throng. But not so the middle-aged man, who I noticed as I passed on by was now busily scattering generous handfuls of grass seed onto the rich brown soil at his feet. I returned a few hours later, somewhat elated, tickets having been exchanged and a colourful ink-scented programme bought, still humming 2-0, 2-0 to myself. However, My elation was not to be as great as his, for his pale blue eyes shone with the undisguised satisfaction of having grass seed sown and a more than respectable bird scarer built. "Your lot will be able to play on here soon," he laughed, pointing at the seed-peppered soil while stroking his snowy white beard. I in turn smiled and nodded politely as I rushed on by in my haste to get ready for my next pilgrimage of the day, a trip that would undoubtedly take me to some smoke-filled, music-throbbing club or other. As the next few weeks passed on by, things had really begun to take shape in his garden, and I mean that quite literally. For as I passed this very day on my way to band practice, the grass seed had already sprouted into soft emerald green shoots, and here and there vivid coloured flowering plants were now holding their heads high towards the sun in place of the vicious paper-clad thorns. I cast my mind back to his passing comment on Pilgrimage Day, and thought that he may well have been right in thinking that my lot would be able to play here soon, for, if truth be told, this turf was certainly beginning to look in better condition. On my return, with ears that were suitably ringing, I noticed him watering the garden with all the care and attention that he could possibly muster. Interestingly, and perhaps you yourself may have noticed, I have at last deigned to refer to the bomb site as a garden, for truly never a more descriptive word had been spoken, as this is what it had now become, a garden in every sense of the word. Time soon marched by as only time can, and soon the icy cold fingers of winter finally gave way to the soft melting breath of spring. This in turn gave way to the heady heat of early summer, and with each passing week the emerald grass was watered, cut and manicured into bowling green perfection. Flower beds arrived, crammed with sweet-smelling delights and nature's most vivid of colours. Prime green trees and bushes swayed in the gentle summer breeze, topped by merry birds singing nature's top 10 hits, their insect accompanying backing groups clicking and buzzing in perfect time, and a rustic fence had been erected that was already adorned by stealthy green creepers with bright pungent-smelling flowers. I noticed as I was on my way to meet my latest flame that he had taken a delivery of several large cardboard crates, the contents of which were unknown to me, for, as ever, I was in a rush. I returned later that evening with love's sweet dream still written across my face, and a smile that was as wide as life itself, only to find the empty cardboard crates by the bin, and a shimmering glass greenhouse standing erect and ready to collect the very best of the sun's summer rays. In no time at all, early summer had become late summer, and as I climbed from the taxicab that was returning me home from my annual vacation, I took note of the potted plants and assorted flowers that had taken up permissible residence within the greenhouse, and I was pretty sure that I could see the green stalks of tomato plants that were already straining under the burgeoning weight of their bulbous red fruits. A small wooden shed had also appeared in the garden, its open door exposing all the tools and implements that had helped play such an important part in the ultimate creation of this gentleman's vision. In the midst of all these things that were growing, flowering, flying or buzzing, I could see him, back bent and working as hard as ever, turning over a bed of soil in preparation of planting goodness knows what. But I didn't have time to hang around, for I had cases to unpack, a shower to take, and friends to meet. This summer soon turned into next summer, and everything was altogether bright and rosy in the garden, as they say. Perhaps this was so in the garden, but not personally so for me, as I sat on my doorstep, head in hands and with a heavy heart that was seemingly stricken by one of life's little burdens. He soon spotted me, at once put down his trowel, and called my name whilst waving me over to him. For once I didn't have any place to be, or anyone else to see, and so answered his call and steadily made my way over. As I entered the garden, I couldn't help but feel spiritually uplifted by the magnificent vibrant colours within, or by the feel of all things growing that so easily surrounded and swamped my senses. But alas, my individual burden was heavy. As we sat atop of his seemingly purpose-built ornate wall, each with a mug of steaming tea in hand, he looked at me with his pale blue eyes and said things that I have since carried with me to this very day, and most probably will, I dare say, for the remainder of my time. It was one of those defining moments in life that we all encounter from time to time, and simply never forget, and I feel sure that you yourself will be more than able to recall your own. He asked what was so obviously troubling me, and I willingly and without so much further prompting shared my burden. After all, a problem shared is a problem halved, as they say. His reaction to my tale was baffling to say the least, for he simply advised me to weed my garden. I truly hadn't a clue what he was on about, and told him as much. But he wasn't offended by my unintentional rebuke, not in the least. Instead, his soft blue eyes twinkled just a little more than usual, and an understanding smile played across his lips, the type of smile that said, as the teacher would say to his students, "Prepare to be taught." He soon went on to elaborate upon his peculiar statement by saying that, in his personal belief, gardening was essentially an analogy of life itself. I shook my head and said that I still didn't understand, and that perhaps I was somehow missing the point. He simply smiled again with that knowing look, and broke the whole thing down as follows. In his analogy, he maintained that at birth we are all given our very own packet of seeds, a mixture of both flowers and weeds, if you like, all good and bad, as well as our own personal garden in which to plant them. Throughout our life, as we plant these seeds, they then germinate into the very things that they are meant to be, flowers or weeds, and then it becomes our task to tend this garden and keep it in good order. For as with a real garden, when things are either neglected or left unattended, the weeds soon take over, and nothing much else grows. Whereas, and in direct contradiction to this rather sad fact, a well-tended garden can't help but blossom with goodness, flowers and fruit. The penny at last was beginning to loudly drop, and, as it were, rattle down my drain pipe, and I felt as if I was beginning to eventually see the light as he went on. A problem is much like a weed, he countered, and left unattended it will soon grow strong and spread until it becomes too big or too much to handle. Deal with it when it's small and vulnerable, and you will hardly notice it at all. We all have choices to both take and make in life, and we all inevitably make mistakes. These alone are the very things that ultimately make us who and what we are. But by tending our own gardens every now and then, most problems can be better, if not easily managed. When he had finished with his lesson, I sat in total silence and complete understanding, whilst truly not knowing quite what to think or say. I simply sat and looked around the garden, and couldn't help but notice the lack of weeds. Oh, I'm sure that they were there, hiding perhaps, or sneaking up behind some plant or other. But I now knew that as soon as they dared to appear, they would be just as swiftly dealt with, leaving order to return. As I continued to sit in what had quickly become silent contemplation, he simply patted my shoulder and went back to his work with an unmistakable look of satisfaction that said, "Job done." To this day I don't know if these 3 words of wisdom came from some book or other, nor even if they had been passed down to him by some other caring soul. In truth, I don't really or much care, because what I do know is that for me they ring true, and are something that I consider often, and, if at all possible, pass on. Many times since that great day of both sharing and learning, I had the blessed opportunity to speak with this gentle soul about a great many other things, and from time to time he would impart other analogies relating to life, or simple words of encouragement and advice, all of which were just as equally cherished. All this took place a long time ago, and I have since moved on and now have a family and garden of my own to both tend and care for. The gentle old soul with the pale blue eyes and snowy white beard that tended his own gardens so graciously and lovingly is sadly no longer with us, but I still carry his memory deep within my heart, along with the essence of his words, because for me he will always be the very thing that this tale is all about. For me he will always be life's gardener, and for me he will forever be my dad.
So that was Life's Gardener by A.P. Bangert. Thank you very much for sending that in. If you do have anything else to send in, send it through to Damien.
rightradio@sheffieldlive.org.
Brilliant.